Thank you for watching. I'm Jim Falk. For me, and I'm sure for many of you, travel and happiness go together. The pandemic not only prevented many of us from seeing our families and friends, it also collapsed the travel industry. The good news is the rebound is here, and it is expected that international tourist arrivals will be back at pre-COVID levels, hopefully in 2024. Joining me remotely to chat about the undeniable connection between travel and happiness is the intrepid traveler, foreign correspondent, and author Eric Weiner, whose New York Times bestsellers include The Geography of Genius and The Geography of Bliss. Eric has joined us on a number of programs, including The Geography of Bliss, and now he's taking his research to countries that are the happiest and most blissful. And we're going to be talking about one of those in just a few minutes. Good to see you, Eric.
Good to see you, Jim.
So, what is it about us as sapiens, I read that book a few months ago, that makes travel such a as essential part of our lives?
Well, it's in our bones and in our genes. Don't forget that for most of human existence, we were not settled in cities and in agricultural environments. We were hunters and gatherers. We were nomads essentially, and motion equaled life for a long time. You had to stay on the move to stay alive. And so I think that's really seeped into us. I think we saw during the depression Freudian slip there. During the pandemic, a lot of depression because people couldn't move. And we realized, I think, for me personally, how much I had taken travel for granted and not recognizing it for the gift that it is.
It must have been torturous for you to be stuck at home when I think about how often you travel, and that's your career. What did you end up doing? Did you write a book or two?
Uh, I started something called the Pajama Travel Club, where I sat in my pajamas and read excerpts from my books and other travel writers and threw those up on YouTube. That helped keep me sane. I read a lot of travel writing. I did some writing, but mostly I climbed the walls, I would say. I went a little nuts for a while.
Like the rest of it. Well, it was a good time to organize your photos, at least.
Yes, exactly.
So, my daughter and son-in-law are getting ready to go to Scotland in just a few days, and I was at their house and I saw this detailed plan of what they were going to do from early morning run to breakfast or lunch and dinner. And I said, aren't you over planning? And so, what do you think about people who approach a trip like that, yet planning is part of the fun?
I would tell your daughter to plan a little, but not too much. When I go to a new destination, I'll read the history of the place, certainly, and read up on that. But I won't read contemporary accounts, and I won't overplan my stay. I mean, the real joy, one of the real joys of travel is the spontaneity and the serendipity, which we don't get so much in our everyday 9 to 5 lives. So I think it's good to have a plan, but it should be like the broadest of plans, and it should have plenty of room for improvisation, I would say.
In one of the articles that I read, you talked about how people don't always remember the good parts of the trip. They remember the bad parts. And that made me think about getting together with members, say, of a travel club or a World Affairs Council or whatever. And it does seem that people start talking about what went wrong, but they often do it with a smile. Why is that?
Uh, because again, I think we're partly is that we're hardwired for negative news. It's known as the negativity bias. The evolutionary psychological explanation is that the threat from the saber-toothed tiger was more vital and important than the nice pond where you could go for a dip. So we pay attention to threats and we pay attention to bad news. So it does stick with us. But over time, the bad news becomes softened and it just makes for a good story. I always say that bad trips make for good stories. And that's true. If you look at the catalog of travel logs, it's not, my trip to Patagonia where everything went perfectly as planned. It's, for instance, a classic from the early 20th century called The Worst Journey in the World by a British explorer who went to Antarctica and everything went wrong and people died, but he made it home. So it's, in a way, surviving a trip and navigating these bumps in the road that makes a trip memorable.
And the fish gets larger, doesn't it, over time?
Yeah, the bump in the road becomes a mountain in the road. It was this big, you know. So that's human nature to exaggerate and to do it from the safety of looking back 10 years.
People like to criticize the United Nations and especially the General Assembly because they seem to be unable to agree on anything. Yet, when was it? In 2018, they came up with a new day to celebrate, a happiness day. Tell us about that.
I believe it's March 20th, and I celebrate it every year. Well, I mean, it's really just putting the cap onto what the UN's been doing for a number of years, which is releasing this World Happiness Report that comes out every year, which looks across the globe at which countries are happy and which are less happy and why that might be. And they just came out a couple of weeks ago with their latest report, the 2023 report, and topping the list for the 6th year in a row was Finland. At the very bottom was Afghanistan and a whole lot of countries in between.
You know, one of the things I saw on that report was that, unfortunately, I think 10 of the bottom 20 were countries from Africa. And that made me wonder about whether or not the criteria is sort of slanted against emerging countries.
I wouldn't say the criteria is, I would say the circumstances of their lives in sub-Saharan Africa. Some, not all countries are slanted against them being happy. We know that, you know, despite this sort of myth of the happy poor person, that is not true. The poorest people in the world tend to be the least happy. We also know that money alone doesn't explain the happiest places. So if a poor country becomes happier, richer and richer, wealthier and wealthier, you'll see their happiness go up. But it will plateau and plateau at a relatively low level. And beyond that point, further increases in wealth don't really explain the bump in happiness. Finland is the happiest country in the world. It's wealthy, but it's not the wealthiest. And why aren't other for instance, Western European countries that are perhaps equally wealthy, why aren't they happier than Finland? Because at that point, there are other factors, social relations, a whole bunch of things we can talk about that become more important.
Well, let's talk about them because when you look at the top of the list, several of them are Nordic countries.
Yes, and this belies another myth, which is that happy places are tropical with palm trees and drinks with little umbrellas in them. You know, this is what, you know, if you're sitting in Michigan in February, you think, boy, Cancun's got to be happy. And it might be happy for you for a week, but look at those Nordic countries, you know, Finland, Denmark, Iceland, you know, that's the top 3 right there. And they're cold and they're dark for much of the year. So it's not about the weather. It's not about the palm trees. It's really about, I would say, the way society is weaved together in those countries, the amount of trust that they have, high levels of personal and institutional trust in Nordic countries goes a long way toward explaining their outsized happiness.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, Finland, you said, has been number 1 for 6 years.
That's right.
That's not the country in your book that you put as number 1. You put Iceland. And why did you do that? And
well, I put Iceland in as the stand-in for the Nordic countries because they jostle positions over the years. And I was particularly fascinated by Iceland because it just seems so unlikely that this small nation, population of 370,000, the whole country, that's the size of a mid-sized American city, you know, small country, isolated in the North Atlantic, cold and dark for much of the year. Why would this be one of the happiest countries in the world? And I went there in January, the coldest and darkest month, and tried to explore that. And I just find it's a creative, fascinating place. In fact, I've launched a new venture called Bliss Tours, and I will be leading happiness tours to Iceland. Hope to add other countries later, but the idea is, you know, there's you can take these wine and cheese tours of France and other trips like that. But as far as I know, there's not another happiness trip like this where we will look at Iceland through the lens of the science of happiness. You know, what makes Iceland happy, and can you take a little happiness home with you along with the souvenirs?
Is there really is there a study of happiness that you might find in universities or academic literature?
Well, there are many studies of happiness. You mean an academic discipline, or do you mean
Yeah,
a broader field?
to that degree, and also, do governments, when they're doing their plans, do they really look at happiness
Hmm.
as a goal that they want to reach?
Okay, good question. Some governments do. It really began with the tiny Himalayan nation of Bhutan, which back in the 1970s launched this idea of gross national happiness. The king at the time was asked about the country's gross national product, and it's very small, of course, but he said, "We're not worried about gross national product, we're focusing on gross national happiness." Bit of a throwaway line at the time, but then they developed a policy around it. And Bhutan is leading that. Other countries, the UK and France, have dabbled in sort of happiness policy. I think under Tony Blair, the British did have a sort of uh, happiness czar, if you will. I'm not sure if they do now. But other nations have toyed with the idea of not replacing GDP, but supplementing it with another measure of happiness in terms of guiding national policy.
And I don't know if they still do, but I think the UAE, United Arab Emirates, had
Yes.
actually a ministry of happiness.
They do. They do. Particularly in Dubai, they have a minister of happiness, and they took their cue directly from Bhutan.
Let's go back to the list because we
Hmm.
talked about the top five and we have a sense of who are in the bottom. Uh, what about Russia and Ukraine when you think about the tragedy that has been there now for, God, 14, 15 months? How has that affected their degree of happiness? I can only imagine it's
This,
really hurt it.
this is one of the surprising things is not as much as you would think. I mean, certainly both countries have taken a hit in happiness, particularly Ukraine. But in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, there was a bigger dip in happiness in Ukraine than there is now when there's an all out war in the country. So you may think, well, that's odd. 2014 was a relatively, comparatively minor military conflict compared to what's going on today. And the explanation for that is that when bad things like a war or a pandemic happen, yes, clearly people are less happy in many, many ways, especially if they're directly affected. But there's also an increase in benevolent feelings, which the psychologists measure through various surveys. We look out for one another. And I think in a country that has a high amount of trust, that has this sort of social infrastructure in place already, when bad things happen, they sort of, it's like money in the bank. They're able to draw upon that reservoir of trust and goodwill. We saw that going back to Iceland. After I went there to research my book quite a few years ago, they suffered a really economic collapse. And I wrote to Icelandic friends saying, "Surely your country's miserable now." And they wrote back saying, "Well, not really. We're struggling, but we don't have to worry about falling into a black hole because there's no black hole to fall into." So it's complex. When bad things happen, sometimes the increase in goodwill will compensate partly, not completely, for the physical suffering.
Another country that lost a bit of its position was Switzerland, and Israel went up.
Yeah, Switzerland's always been doing quite well. It's always been in the top five or top 10. That's interesting because, as you probably know, it's not the most electric country in the world. I mean, it's pleasant, but it's a bit dull. It's a bit boring, and the Swiss will admit that. But that's one of the lessons from the science of happiness is that you're better off being at that sort of nice humming along content level of, say, Switzerland than you are of, say, a more mercurial Mediterranean nation like Italy, where there are these ups and downs. There's something about that nice content level that the Swiss have. Israel's a bit of a mystery to me, why they have bumped up so high. They've always been sort of in the middle ground. Um, I know you look at the news, you look at the internal tensions, the external threats, and you would say, how could the Israelis be happy? But again, if you had to attribute to anything, I would attribute it to that communal feeling that sometimes being under threat from the outside, at least, will bring people together.
I think that's true. I mean, it's the whole expression rally around the flag.
Around the flag, and I would say around each other. I think,
Sure.
when you talk to soldiers, Marines, et cetera, who've been in war, and you ask them like what they're doing it for, they might say country, but they really say for their fellow Marine. They're looking out for each other, and it's like a family. And I think that kind of rallying around happens during tough times.
And what about the United States? I'm sure people are wondering where we stand now.
We may be an economic and military superpower, but Jim, we are not a happiness superpower, and not yet in 2023. We are at number 15, which is more or less where we've been for a very long time.
Hmm.
We could probably talk for an hour about why that is. I think one of the reasons is, in a strange way, it's the self-help industrial complex, which tells us that we should be happy. When you live in the land of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, happiness becomes not only a possibility, but an expectation. And if you're not happy, you feel like there's something wrong with you. I have experienced that in my life. And I think, in a way, the fact that happiness is uniquely enshrined in our founding documents puts pressure on us to
I wonder
be happy.
I wonder what you think about this. So, I mean, when I think about the United States, I always think about economic growth quarter to quarter. How does happiness tie into productivity? Does it encourage it, or does productivity encourage happiness or discourage it?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I know that when they ask people how much money they would need to be happier, they say usually 20%. And when they go back to those people who have now acquired this 20%, they say, well, how much money do you need to be happier? They'll say 20%. So we don't always know how much is enough. I think that's true with income. I suspect it's true with productivity. Would an economist ever say there's enough productivity in the US, that we have the right amount? Can there be excessive productivity? I think there can, from a psychological point of view. I don't know if economists would say that there's such a thing as too much productivity.
We talked a minute ago about my daughter's trip. She'll probably be really embarrassed that I mentioned this, but what are the other ideas or guidelines, advice that you might give? I remember, I guess it was a year or two ago, you wrote a great article in a FAR called Your Travel Manifesto.
Yes, and one of them is to travel alone whenever you can, unless you're joining my trip to Iceland. I'll make an exception there. Otherwise, travel alone. I do when I'm researching a book, working on a project, because it makes you more vulnerable, more accessible to others. If you're in a group, it says, oh, leave us alone. Even a group of two, if you're by yourself, you're much likely to have genuine interactions with local people.
And Eric, let me interrupt you there, because as a graduate at University of Virginia, I always have to find quotations from Thomas Jefferson. And
it's required.
It's required to get your degree. You have to commit to it. This was a letter written in 1787. Thomas Jefferson said, I think one travels more usefully when they travel alone because they reflect more.
I think Tommy Jefferson was absolutely right. I think that you have time to reflect, you have time to interact. Benjamin Franklin said, travel lengthens life. That it's our one way of making it feel like we're actually living longer. And he lived to the age of 84. So travel alone, travel with very few expectations, or I would say no expectations, either positive or negative. Leave room to be surprised by your destination. And I would say time is your friend when you're traveling. I realize you can't always, people have limited amounts of vacation time. When I go somewhere, I'll plan my trip, figure out how much time I need generously, and then always add 25% to that. And I've never regretted it, because you really need time to linger or loiter in a place and soak it up.
What about the darn iPhone and everybody taking pictures all the time and not really looking and seeing what they're there for?
It's a problem, and I'm as guilty of it as anyone else. I find myself pulling out the phone and snapping photos, and I have to train myself. not to do that and to just be in the moment. And I think we do lose something when we're always looking through the lens of a phone or a camera, for that matter. There's something to be said for simply experiencing the place. And you are taking pictures, you're just taking them with your mind, and you'll have clearer, more memorable pictures if you take them with your mind and not with your iPhone.
So, just in the last few weeks, I've been seeing a variety of articles, one concerning Amsterdam, how they are putting in some new regulations because the Brits have been so wild in certain quarters of Amsterdam. Also, I saw that Bali is really concerned about some of the pollution and other issues and really the rudeness of various tourists. So, how should tourists, I guess the best way to say it, is be more empathetic?
I would say to be more humble. I think that the problem is when tourists travel arrogantly, when they treat a place like it's their own when it's not, or when they think they know a place when they don't necessarily. I would say some humility is something you should pack in your suitcase when you go on a trip. And look, I've studied a bit the history of tourism. I mean, mass tourism goes back to the mid 19th century in England with Thomas Cook sending train loads of pilgrims and tourists from the Midlands down to London. So probably ever since then, if not before, there have been ugly travelers, ugly Americans, ugly Germans, etc. It's all we can do is try to be more mindful and more humble when we travel.
And when someone comes to you and says, I want to travel to a country like France that is obviously well traveled, how do you advise them not just to go to Paris and go to the Louvre?
I would say to just disabuse yourself of this idea that you need to see certain things. There is nothing you need to see in Paris. You do not need to go to the Eiffel Tower. You do not need to go to the Louvre. And if your friends say, well, where's the pictures from the Eiffel Tower? You say, I went to, this little cafe in the Marais district instead, or whatever it is. So people trip themselves up when they think there are things they have to see. And once you liberate yourself from that, you're free to do whatever you want.
I saw a statistic yesterday that said people who travel, God knows how they came up with this statistic, are 6 or 7% happier than those who don't. Have you seen that? Do you agree?
I mean, I absolutely agree. But happiness in that case, I think, is not the same as pleasure. I mean, the tourist will travel, and we've all done this. There's nothing wrong with it. Sometimes simply for pleasure, to lie on a beach. But in my mind, the best motivation for travel, and this is my all-time favorite travel quote. It comes from the American writer Henry Miller. He said, "One's destination is never a place, but a new way of looking at things." And that is the real power of travel, and might explain that 6 or 7% bump in happiness is when you travel, it's like putting on a new pair of glasses and you're seeing the world just a bit differently. And, that's travel at its best. When that happens, that's terrific.
And I suspect you feel, as I do, that when you travel to another country, you come back and you look at your own country in a different way.
That is one of the benefits of travel and of living abroad, is you come back and you'll notice things here in America that you didn't before. I always describe culture as national culture as like a goldfish bowl. And the goldfish doesn't know it's in the bowl. It's just in this water. It doesn't even know it's water. It's just the environment. Take the goldfish out and then plop, and it realizes, oh my God, I need to be back in the goldfish bowl, plop it back in, and it's going to appreciate and see the water for the first time. And travel is very much like that when you come back home. The problem is it wears off. I come back and I'm absolutely amazed by the size of our portions at restaurants, for instance. I'm like, oh my God, they're huge. I didn't realize that. And after a couple of weeks, I'm like, totally used to it and asking for seconds.
When you travel, do you keep up with what's going on in the United States like you do when you're here?
Not particularly. I mean, why would I? Unless it was part of my job. The whole idea is to get away from the noise. or get away from our noise to someone else's noise, which can be more like music, right? So I try to tune out the news when I'm overseas. I try to just be where I am. And that means, keeping, internet time to a minimum, reading the news to a minimum. I'll read the local news if I'm in Bhutan or Iceland or wherever and try to immerse myself in that place. But no, I don't want to be tethered to back home.
I know how much you like Bhutan. Will that be the next trip you do for your happiness travel program?
I hope so. I hope so. First Iceland, geoblisttours.com, and then off to Bhutan, hopefully. Bhutan, well, we'll talk about that another time. It's a fascinating place.
And I have to agree, I just loved my trip to Iceland, except may I tell people, don't eat very much of that shark. That smell is horrible. What's it called?
It's called harkle, and it's harkle, and it's rotten shark, and they call it a delicacy. Delicacy translation, we like it, you're going to find it disgusting. That's basically it.
I did. So bottom line, what can we do to be happier?
Work on your relationships. Sartre said hell is other people. I think he was hanging out with the wrong crowd. Heaven is other people. Happiness is other people. Get out of your bubble. Get out of your own skin. Connect with other people on a deep, meaningful level, and you will be happier, I guarantee.
That is great advice. Eric, always wonderful to see you. Continued good luck with all your travels. And thank all of you for watching our program. Eric, you have convinced me that travel and happiness go together. In fact, others agree, as researchers from Washington State University found that people who travel were indeed happier than those who stayed at home. The overwhelmingly majority of travelers say that their travel memories are among the happiest ones of their life. And as Eric told us, even delays and other snafus over time can be recalled as blissful. To watch our prior programs with Eric, where we chatted about the Geography of Bliss and the Socrates Express, be sure to go to McQuistionTV.com, where we talk about things that matter with people who care.